Our sermon text is recorded in John chapter 18, verses 33 through 37. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." This is God's word. He was a king unlike any other, but the world didn't recognize him. They didn't recognize him because he didn't look like a king. He wasn't what they expected a king to look like. He didn't have the background or the resume or the credentials of what they expected out of a king, but he was a king. He is a king. Does anyone know who I'm talking about? That's right. The king of football himself, Tom Brady. Tom Brady is the king of football. He has more Super Bowl rings than anybody else, and he has a mile-high list of other accolades as well. And whether you love him or hate him, whether you watch football or not, he is the king of football. But what I love about his story was that he was overlooked. Do you realize that when Tom Brady was drafted into the NFL, he was picked 199? Isn't that crazy? That 198 players before him were picked, saying that they would be a better football player. And there's a reason for that. He didn't have the big, bulky muscles like the other guys. He wasn't super fast or speedy like the other guys. He didn't have a big university name behind him. He didn't have the background credentials of what you would expect someone to be. But yet, even though he was overlooked, he became the best ever. And what I love is I saw a quote from one of the scouts talking about this incident, and this is what they said. "We were looking at his outward appearance, but we weren't looking at his heart, to see that he had a heart of a champion." And that quote, that line, plays in very well for our story today as well. Jesus standing before Pontius Pilate. Because Jesus had the same problem. Jesus is king of the universe. But when Jesus came to this world, people didn't recognize him as a king because he didn't look like a king. His outward appearance, he wasn't wearing a golden crown or holding a scepter. He looked like a prisoner on death row, standing before a judge. And throughout Jesus' ministry, he didn't have a big army. He didn't have an iron fist ready to threaten the Romans. Instead, he preached a message of gentleness and peace and forgiveness. He didn't have followers fanning him with fans and dropping grapes into his mouth. He didn't have a giant throne to sit on. But yet, Jesus is a king. But if you look at just his outward appearance, you might miss it. You might miss that Jesus is a king. You might see Jesus and think of him as just a gentle teacher that won't be able to help you through your life. Or on the other side of things, if you think of Jesus as just a king, just as someone who is just and powerful, that might terrify you, make you feel guilty. But instead of looking at Jesus' outward appearance today, we get to see his heart. We get to see Jesus' heart, see what he cares about, see what he values, and we get to see that he is a king unlike any other. So today I'm going to break this message down into 3 parts. Part number 1, the difference between Jesus and earthly kings. Number 2, the problem of seeing Jesus as an earthly king. And number 3, the joy of serving in his kingdom. So first we're going to talk about how Jesus is unlike other kings out there, every other king that ever reigned. Then we're going to talk about how dangerous it is for us if we start to see Jesus more like an earthly king as opposed to a spiritual king. Then finally we're going to talk about what a joy it is that we get to be in Jesus' kingdom. The difference, the problem, and the joy. So first, let's talk about how Jesus is different than any other king. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" So Jesus is on trial, and he's getting tossed around between different leaders and rulers because the Jewish people as a whole, they didn't like Jesus, and they wanted him dead. And they would do anything to make sure that this would happen. So they put this lie out there. They started saying that Jesus is this blasphemer. He's this political tyrant that's going to threaten the Romans. So what they did is Jesus went to Annas and Caiaphas. He had already gone to the Jewish leaders, and then they took him to Pontius Pilate. And they bring the accusation about Jesus. They say, hey, he's this political tyrant. He's threatening you guys. You better crucify him. And so Pilate decides to take Jesus in his palace by himself and question him. So Pilate asks him, well, are you the king of the Jews? And this is a bit of a trick question, because Jesus can't simply say yes or no. Imagine what would happen if Jesus simply said, yes, I am the king of the Jews. Well, then you know what Pilate would do? He would walk right back out to the crowd and say, I got him. He said he's the king of the Jews. Let's put him to death. But what would happen if Jesus said, no, I'm not a king? Well, then Jesus would be lying, because he is king of the universe. So they're trying to put in Jesus in this trick question idea to get him to say yes or no, but Jesus doesn't give a yes or no answer. They go back and forth a little bit talking, and eventually Jesus says this. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. So 3 times, Jesus says, my kingdom, my kingdom, my kingdom. Depending on what Bible translation you use in your bulletins, it actually only shows up twice. But in the original language, it shows up 3 times. And I think that's significant, because Jesus does not flat out just say, yes, I am a king. But he says, my kingdom, enough times to show that he does have a kingdom, but it's not the type of kingdom that these false people are accusing him of. Jesus talks about how he has a kingdom, but it's not like earthly kings of this world. Because if he was an earthly king like this world, he would have an army. When he was getting arrested, he would have followers try and fight back against the people who were arresting him. And since he doesn't have followers like that, since Jesus isn't trying to grow an empire, trying to get as much power as he can, Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. And Jesus' plan worked. He said, my kingdom, my kingdom, my kingdom, to which led Pilate to say, you are a king then. Pilate's figuring it out. He's saying, okay, if these guys talking about a kingdom, he must be a king. To which Jesus says, you say that I am a king. You say that I'm a king. He didn't stand up and say, yes, I'm a king, just like these Jewish leaders are saying about me. You figured it out, you're a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. So once again, Jesus makes it clear that yes, he is a king, but his kingdom is so different. He didn't come to this world like other earthly kings to grow the kingdom, to build a vast army, to try and conquer the world. Jesus came to this world to speak the truth. The truth, namely, that he is the Savior, that he had come to free us from our sins and to die on the cross for us. And everyone who is part of Jesus' kingdom are those who believe that truth, that Jesus is the Savior. So Jesus is a king unlike any other king. Part 2. The problem of seeing Jesus as an earthly king. So what happens if we miss this, if we don't see Jesus as the spiritual king that he is? Well, there are a couple stories in the Bible, a couple case studies that we get to look at of people who got the wrong idea about what Jesus is as a king. The first story I want to talk about is this story up here. It's when Jesus was arrested, and Jesus' most prominent disciple, Peter, remember what he did? He took out his sword, and he chopped off a guy's ear named Malchus, which there's some king thoughts right in that idea. Do you know that Malchus's name literally means king? So Jesus is showing what it's like to be a king. Peter chops off an ear, and instead of saying, good job, Peter, thanks for fighting for me, Jesus rebukes him, tells Peter, put your sword away, and he picks up the ear off the ground and attaches it right back to Malchus's head. And what is Jesus teaching us about his kingdom by doing that? Well, he's telling us that Jesus' kingdom doesn't grow like other kingdoms. Jesus' kingdom isn't going to grow by the sword. It's going to grow by speaking the truth in love. And every once in a while, people fail to understand that. There have been some dark times in church history when people tried to grow God's kingdom with force or with a sword. Have you heard of the Crusades before? It was a time when people literally went to war and said, if you don't believe in Jesus, we are going to cut you down. Have you heard of the Inquisition before? It was a time in the church where they hunted down false teachers and said, if you're a false teacher, we are going to torture you and put you to death. And the reason I bring that up is because every once in a while people look at Christians and look at the church and say, well, what do you have to say about that? Look how bad the church has done over the years. We should just get rid of all churches. And to that we say, I am not a pro-crusader. I am not pro-inquisition. That was bad. People did bad things in the past. God's kingdom doesn't grow by the sword. Jesus very clearly taught us that, and people weren't listening to that. And even though I have a feeling you're not tempted to try and grow God's kingdom with a sword, every once in a while, we try to force people into God's kingdom, and it never goes well. I recently heard a story. I have a friend who's a pastor in Texas, and he was telling me about a couple who was coming to his church. The lady, she had always been going to church there. She grew up in a Wisconsin Synod church like ours, and she now has a serious boyfriend. But the problem was her serious boyfriend doesn't believe in Jesus, so she put her foot down and said, I'm not going to marry you unless you believe in Jesus and become a member of our church. So they sit down with the pastor, do like 10 weeks of Bible information class. And the guy, he's not very interested, he's not very active in class, doesn't really seem to be sticking for him. But at the end of the Bible information class, the woman says to the pastor, Pastor, my boyfriend would like to say something to you. To which the boyfriend says, in the most sheepish way possible, can I become a member of your church? And we twisted somebody's arm into God's kingdom. Doesn't feel good, does it? Doesn't feel good when we guilt or coerce somebody into God's kingdom. It doesn't work like that. And don't get me wrong, I think it is good for people to say, I'm not going to marry somebody unless they have the same faith as me. I think it's good for somebody to put their foot down like that. But the frustrating thing that happens, that when people that we love in our life don't believe in Jesus, or if you have people in your life that turn away from Jesus, you can't just force them back in. And it's hard. You might have grandchildren or children that went off to college and left the faith, and sometimes our solution is, I'm just going to tell them how it is, I'm just going to tell them the business, and they're just going to come back and believe in Jesus again. That's hard. It doesn't work like that. God's kingdom won't grow by force or by the sword. We need to remember that. Second example. The famous story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. I'm sure you've heard the story before. Jesus multiplies the fishes. Everyone has enough fill. They have full bellies and smiles on their faces. And at the end of the story, there's an interesting verse. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Do you see how people had a wrong understanding of what Jesus' mission was? The people back then, with any earthly king, you have a very transactional type of relationship with a king. The king rules, provides for the people, provides safety in a kingdom, and in return, the people serve the king. And they're looking at Jesus, they're seeing this guy that can multiply bread, and they're saying, I want to follow that guy. I want him to be my king. I will serve him as long as he keeps giving me free bread. Very transactional type of relationship. But Jesus withdraws from the crowd. He doesn't let this happen because his goal is not to become an earthly king. And the danger is, if we ever start to see God like a transactional king. I'll do my part. I'll serve Jesus in my kingdom. I'll come to church. I'll give an offering. I'll try and be a good person. And in return, God better provide me with safety and health for me and my family. And if things go wrong, I'm going to rebel against King Jesus. Do you see how somebody could get that attitude? I do my part, God better do his. But do you understand that if you address God that way, I'm going to do my part. God's going to do his. Do you know what God would have the right to do? Strike us all down. Because we are by nature sinful and rebellious and cannot serve God perfectly in his kingdom. God would have every right to strike us down if we expect a transactional relationship between us and God. But instead, what do we get? We get the joy of serving in Jesus' kingdom. Because when Jesus came to this world, he didn't wear a golden crown. Instead, he had a crown of thorns put on his head. Jesus didn't come to this world with a sword ready to strike us down in his hand. Instead, Jesus had nails put through his hands. Jesus was mocked. They said, look at that, the King of the Jews. They put a robe on him. They put a sign above his head and made fun of him. But Jesus, the King of the universe, came to this world to lay down his life for you and me. Jesus set aside his power. Jesus didn't come to this world to grow a kingdom by force or to get as much power and pleasure in this world that he could. Instead, Jesus came to this world to die for you. And since we know that we have a king that is so different than the rest, what a joy it is to serve him. What a joy it is to serve God in his kingdom, knowing what he has done for us. So whatever position of power God has put you in, whatever authority God has given you, whatever possessions he has blessed you with, you will look at your life and ask the question, instead of how do I grow my kingdom, how do I grow God's kingdom? How do I serve him? How do I use my position of power and authority and possessions to serve King Jesus? Because we know that one day Jesus will come back and we will get to be in his kingdom for eternity. So as we wait for King Jesus to come back, we serve him with joy. And that's exactly what Queen Victoria did. In the recent passing of Queen Elizabeth, there has been a story about Queen Victoria going around. Queen Victoria, she's the one of British royalty. She lived in the 1800s, and she was a devout Christian. She went to church very often. And there's a story going around about Queen Victoria. She went to church, and the pastor was talking about Jesus' second coming, how Jesus is going to come back again on Judgment Day, and we will get to be with him. And you know what Queen Victoria said? She said, oh, I wish Jesus comes back in my lifetime. To which the pastor said, well, why? Why do you want Jesus to come back in your lifetime? I should so love to lay my crown at his feet. And that is the right way of waiting for King Jesus to come back. Jesus puts us in power. I know I'm not talking to any British royalty right now, right? But you have some type of power in your life. You have some type of authority in your life. You have some type of possessions in your life. Whatever God has given you, use it to serve him. Because he is the King of the universe who laid down his life for you. And knowing what he did for you, we joyfully serve as we wait. Because when Jesus came to this world, he looked like a prisoner on death row. He wore a crown of thorns. But a day is coming when King Jesus will come back. When you will hear the trumpet, you will hear the sound, you will hear an archangel speak, and the skies will open up, and from the skies will come down King Jesus wearing a royal crown and a royal robe, and we will get to serve him for eternity. And as we wait for that day, we serve. As we wait for that day, we look forward to when King Jesus comes back, and we get to kneel before him and worship him. We do this all in his name.